Chapter 1. The Council's Worst Fear. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council was a place of order, diplomacy, and ancient traditions, a sanctum of interstellar governance where species that had once waged wars upon one another now came together to determine the fate of the galaxy. Built within the hollowed-out core of a moon orbiting a dying star, it was a chamber of impossible scale where the leaders of over 100 civilizations convened, their floating platforms circling the vast, central dais like celestial bodies drawn into orbit by a singular force. The air was thick with tension, filled with the low murmurs of diplomats, military leaders, and scholars alike, each of them aware that today's gathering was unlike any before it. An emergency session had been called, an event so rare that some council members had abandoned crucial negotiations and political upheavals in their own sectors to attend. Even the Krithak swarm, a species so xenophobic they barely participated in council matters, had sent a delegate, their multi-eyed, chitinous form gleaming under the chamber's ethereal glow. There was an unspoken understanding among the gathered species that something had gone horribly wrong, something urgent, dire, and possibly catastrophic. At the center of it all stood Councillor Vri of the Thalzar Dominion, a species known for their methodical, logic-driven approach to governance. Vri was a towering figure, his bioluminescent tendrils coiling and flickering with barely suppressed frustration, his elongated fingers tightening around the ceremonial staff that marked his station. His species did not anger easily, nor did they resort to sensationalist outbursts. Yet here he stood, trembling with something that could only be described as sheer panic. A hush fell over the chamber as he raised his staff, signaling for silence. And then, in a voice that echoed through the great hall like the tolling of a cosmic bell, he spoke. "We have a problem." There was no grandeur to his words, no carefully measured rhetoric, just raw urgency. The murmurs ceased instantly, and hundreds of alien eyes focused on him. Vri exhaled, his tendrils curling tighter against his form. "The humans. We have to stop them." A ripple of confusion spread through the delegates, followed by a cacophony of overlapping voices. Some muttered in irritation, others in curiosity. The humans had long been a topic of debate within the council, but never in a manner so immediate, so desperate. A representative from the Alari Consortium, a species renowned for their mathematical precision and economic prowess, clicked their mandibles in disapproval. "Councillor Vri, we have addressed the human problem before. Their reckless expansion, their refusal to abide by standard interstellar colonization laws, their insistence on intermingling in affairs that do not concern them, all of this has been logged and debated extensively." Vri slammed his staff against the platform. The room shook. Not physically. Of course, the Grand Hall was far too advanced to be disturbed by mere theatrics. The weight of his action sent a shockwave through the political atmosphere. "You do not understand," he said, his voice edged with something dangerously close to desperation. "It is not their politics, not their meddling, not their expansion." He paused, and then, with a breath that seemed to summon all the dread of the void itself, he uttered the words that would change the course of the discussion forever. "It is their breeding." Silence. A dead, suffocating silence. For several moments, no one spoke. No one moved. It was as if every oxygen-processing species in the chamber had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Then, chaos. "What? This is absurd. Explain yourself immediately, Vri." A representative from the Skari Dominion, a reptilian species known for their stringent genetic purity, hissed in contempt. "Are you suggesting that the humans are somehow reproducing at a rate that threatens galactic stability? That is hardly a crisis worthy of an emergency session. "No," Vri interrupted, his voice slicing through the noise like a blade. "I am saying they are breeding with everything. Everything." The word hung in the air, heavy, terrible, incomprehensible. The council chamber erupted again. "Impossible. That is biologically unfeasible." "What do you mean, everything? Explain." Vri waved a hand, and the central dais illuminated with holographic projections, displaying reports, footage, genetic data all compiled from dozens of worlds, all pointing to a horrifying truth. Humans were not just reproducing amongst themselves. They were reproducing with alien species. Not just one or two. Dozens. Across the stars, Across the many factions and empires that made up the galactic community, humans had managed to break the fundamental laws of genetic incompatibility. They were creating hybrids, and the numbers were increasing exponentially. The footage displayed in the chamber was indisputable. Reports from the Elderly archives detailing successful human-Alari offspring, despite the two species having entirely different reproductive structures. Genetic analyses from the Krithax laboratories, proving that humans had somehow produced viable offspring with a species that reproduced via parthenogenesis, a process previously believed impossible to merge with external DNA. Visual evidence from the VA-Lari ascendancy, showing humans-Alaran hybrids thriving in environments neither parent species could survive in alone. It defied science. It defied reason. It defied the very fabric of interspecies biology. A representative from the Vishari Council, a species that reproduced solely through genetic cloning, looked physically ill. This is unnatural. It is beyond unnatural, Vries said, his tendrils twitching erratically. It is an abomination. An affront to the order of the cosmos. If this is allowed to continue, then in a matter of generations, there will be no such thing as a pure species anymore. His words sent another wave of unease through the chamber. For centuries, interspecies breeding had been an impossibility, a biological dead end. Even species with vaguely similar genetic structures found reproduction across evolutionary lines to be a fool's errand, an issue of incompatible DNA, reproductive barriers, and cellular rejection. Humans had shattered that rule. Somehow, through biological absurdity or sheer determination, they had found ways to integrate their genetic code with others, producing offspring that could not exist. And they were doing it everywhere. This is not an isolated phenomenon, Vries continued, his voice dark. This is happening across multiple sectors. If we do not intervene now, then within a few centuries, there will no longer be individual species, only a galaxy that has been assimilated by human genetics. A human-dominant galaxy. The realization settled over the chamber like a suffocating weight. The humans. They weren't conquering through war. They weren't expanding through political coercion or military force. They were spreading through bloodlines, through biological integration, through sheer, unrelenting reproductive capability. And if they weren't stopped, if they continued at their current pace, the very concept of alien species might cease to exist altogether. Vries turned, his gaze sweeping across the chamber, his voice like thunder. We have to stop them. And for the first time in Galactic Council history, no one argued. Chapter 2. The Council's Response. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council had never known silence so absolute, nor tension so thick. The weight of Vria's declaration hung over the assembly like a dark nebula, suffocating, undeniable. Humans were breeding with anything and everything. And if the data was to be believed, they were doing it at a rate that defied all logic, science, and interstellar history. For countless generations, interspecies reproduction had been a dead end, a biological impossibility. Even species with near-identical DNA structures failed to produce viable offspring, their genetic materials rejecting one another, as if the very cosmos itself had drawn a clear, immutable boundary between different species. But humans had somehow shattered that fundamental rule. And they had done it not through technology, not through genetic manipulation, not through artificial means, but naturally. It was incomprehensible. It was terrifying. And it had to be stopped. The moment Vria's words had faded into the vast chamber, the silence had stretched, becoming a chasm filled with unspoken horror. Counselors from every corner of the known universe struggled to process the reality before them. Some sat frozen, their minds racing through the implications, while others whispered in hushed, frantic tones, seeking answers that did not exist. Then, the shouting began. "This must be an exaggeration," declared High Scholar Zeltar of the Volari Ascendancy, their translucent tendrils shifting in distress. "Genetic barriers exist for a reason. Are you suggesting that humans are, what, violating the very laws of biology?" Vria's voice was cold. "I am suggesting that they already have." A representative from the Skari Dominion, a reptilian race that had long prided itself on genetic purity, slammed his clawed fist against his podium. "This is an affront to everything we stand for. If we do not act, our species will be diluted beyond recognition." Ambassador Kern of the Alari Consortium, an insectoid species known for their methodical logic, clicked his mandibles in quiet horror. The data, it is irrefutable. These offspring should not exist. And yet, they do. They are not sterile, nor are they unstable genetic anomalies. They are thriving. The idea sent shockwaves through the chamber. The hybrids were not weak. They were not lesser. They were stronger. A terrifying realization set in. Humans were not just integrating. They were enhancing. Their offspring with the Krithak swarm possessed biological adaptations previously unique to their insectoid ancestors, including adaptive exoskeletal regeneration. Their hybrids with the Valari had inherited the ability to survive in deep space without suits for extended periods, something not even pure Valari had achieved. And the Zalaran human hybrids. They could survive in gravitational forces that would crush most species. Somehow, humans were absorbing the best traits of the species they interbred with, creating genetic combinations that should have never existed. Counselor Threlkos of the Vishari cloning dominion, a species that had long considered themselves genetically superior due to their ability to reproduce through controlled cellular duplication, spoke in a hushed, almost fearful tone. They are evolving, not just surviving, not just integrating, but becoming something else entirely. That was the moment the real panic set in. Because suddenly, the future of the galaxy had changed. If this was not stopped, if humans were allowed to continue their reckless interbreeding, then within generations, there would be no more distinct species. There would be only hybrids. And those hybrids would be human-dominant. The implications sent a wave of dread through the chamber. This wasn't just about genetics. This was about survival. If the humans were allowed to continue, they wouldn't need to conquer. They wouldn't need war. They would simply become. The proposal, containment or eradication. As the panic reached its peak, Supreme Chancellor Zerval of the Galactic Council finally raised a hand, his presence enough to silence the chamber. The ancient leader of the council, his form composed of shifting energy patterns encased in an elaborate exosuit, regarded the assembly with cold calculation. Enough. The chamber stilled. Zerval's gaze swept across the gathered representatives, taking in the raw emotion, the barely contained fear. His voice, when it came, was even, controlled. We cannot afford hysteria. We must act with precision. The question before us is clear. How do we contain the human threat? A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber. Containment. That was the logical step. Vri nodded. I propose the immediate restriction of human expansion. All interspecies relations involving humans must be outlawed. Any existing human-alien unions must be dissolved. A few counselors hesitated, but most nodded in agreement. But then Counselor Threlkos spoke again, his voice uneasy. That is not enough. Silence. Vri turned to him. Elaborate. Threlkos exhaled, his form dimming slightly as he spoke his next words. Even if we stop human expansion, the hybrids already exist, and they will continue to spread. If we do not act with absolute certainty, this problem will return, stronger than before. A dreadful pause. Then he said the words that would shake the council to its core. We must consider eradication. The reaction was immediate. Unacceptable. That is genocide. There are laws. Threlkos slammed a fist against his console. There are no laws that govern what has never been seen before. If we do not take decisive action now, the humans will consume us through their very biology. A dark energy settled over the chamber. The proposal was horrifying. But was it wrong? They all had seen the data. They all knew what was happening. And more than a few of them, in the darkest corners of their minds, had begun to wonder if extinction was the only way. The secret vote. Zerval spoke again. There will be a vote. Containment or eradication. A shudder ran through the chamber. It was the most significant decision in the history of the Galactic Council. The vote was cast in silence. And when the results appeared before them, a heavy, suffocating stillness settled over the assembly. Because containment had not won. Eradication had, by a narrow margin. Vria's expression was unreadable. Threlkos exhaled. Zerval's voice rang through the chamber, final and unyielding. Then it is decided. The human species must be removed. And across the galaxy, a war that no human had foreseen was about to begin. Chapter 3. The War for Survival. The decision had been made. Deep within the core of the artificial moon that housed the Galactic Council, the most powerful species in the known universe had voted. By a narrow margin, the decree had been passed. Humanity was to be eradicated. It was not a decision made lightly. It was not a decision any of them had anticipated. But as the data had been presented, as the horrifying truth of human genetic integration had been laid bare, there had been no choice. If left unchecked, the humans would not conquer the galaxy through war, through politics, or through military might. They would assimilate it through blood. They were spreading, unstoppable, unnatural. Their offspring with alien species were not genetic aberrations, not biological mistakes. They were stronger, smarter, more adaptable than their ancestors. Each hybrid inherited the best traits from both species, creating a lineage that defied the very fabric of interstellar biology. And it was accelerating. In less than 3 generations, nearly every major civilization had reported instances of human interbreeding. Some species that had never been able to reproduce with outsider species that had been isolated for thousands of years were now giving birth to human variant offspring. That was not a coincidence. That was a crisis. And so, the Council had acted. Humanity would be purged. It would start with containment, blockades, travel restrictions, diplomatic severance. But that was only the first step, because containment was never truly the goal. Eradication was. And to achieve that, the Galactic Council had begun planning the single greatest military campaign in galactic history, a war that would determine the fate of an entire species. The plan: extinction protocols. Within hours of the vote, the Council's military strategists convened in secret. The full-scale extermination of humanity would not be easy. Unlike other primitive species that had been culled in the past, humans were not weak. They were not defenseless. They were not technologically stagnant. In just 2 centuries, they had spread beyond their homeworld, establishing colonies, forming alliances, integrating themselves into the galactic economy. They had influence. They had resources. They had weapons. And worst of all, they had the hybrids. New generations of half-human offspring were already emerging as influential figures in interstellar politics, defense sectors, and scientific research. Some were even beginning to hold leadership positions within non-human governments. This was not just a war against Earth. This was a war against any species that had allowed humans to integrate. The extermination plan had 3 stages. Stage 1. Isolation. All human travel between systems would be immediately cut off. Their access to trade routes, technology, and interstellar communications would be severed. Human diplomats, scholars, and merchants in foreign territories would be detained or expelled. The goal was simple: make humanity truly alone again. Stage 2. Genetic cleansing. The hybrids had to be eradicated first. Before any open war could begin, the Council would launch covert operations to track down and eliminate all known human hybrid populations. Every genetic database, every medical record, every hidden colony where human genes had spread would be systematically purged. This was where the real horror began, because some Council members had already proposed preemptive sterilization. If the hybrids could not be eliminated directly, then they would be rendered incapable of reproducing. Entire bloodlines would be erased, not through war, but through forced genetic modification. Stage 3. The final purge. Once the hybrids had been dealt with, the full force of the Galactic Armada would be turned upon the remaining human strongholds. Earth would be blockaded, its defense systems crippled, its major cities systematically wiped out from orbit. This would be total war. It would be the complete, unrelenting extermination of a species that had defied the natural order. And it would be the first time in recorded history that the entire Galactic Council had unified against a single enemy. There would be no negotiations. There would be no surrender. Only extinction. The humans discover the truth. But for all the Council's planning, they had made one mistake. They had underestimated the humans. Word of the extermination order did not remain secret for long. Information leaked, first in whispers, then in warnings, then in full-fledged panic. By the time the humans had confirmed the truth, it was already too late to negotiate. They had been declared an anomaly, a genetic plague. They were no longer considered a species with rights. They were prey. The reaction was immediate. Every major human colony declared martial law. The Terran Alliance recalled all military forces, pulling every warship, every soldier, every strategic asset back toward their core worlds. Civilian ships fled into deep space, seeking refuge in lawless sectors where council authority was weak. Some species, those who had truly integrated with humanity, chose to stand with them. But most remained silent, because to stand with humanity was to invite their own destruction. On Earth, in the underground bunkers beneath the shattered ruins of old nations, humanity's leaders gathered in secret. The news was beyond comprehension, beyond belief. They had known for years that some species feared their rapid expansion. That was expected. But this was a genocide, a planned, deliberate erasure of their people. And if they did not fight back, if they did not act immediately, humanity would cease to exist. There was no room for diplomacy. There was only war. The first strike, Earth's response. And so, humanity did what it had always done. It adapted. It survived. And then it struck back. When the first wave of council fleets arrived at the edges of human space, they expected surrender. They expected fear. They expected the end of a species. What they got instead was hellfire. Humanity's forces were waiting. From the asteroid belts of Sol to the militarized stations of Proxima Centauri, the first great battle of survival began. The council fleets, massive and overwhelming, were met with a defense so brutal, so calculated, that for the first time in history, they faltered. Human ships did not fight like other species. They did not rely on overwhelming firepower. They did not adhere to traditional battle formations. They fought like they had nothing left to lose. They weaponized the very laws of physics. They detonated entire moons, turning planetary orbits into weapons. They hijacked council AI systems, turning their own fleets against them. They unleashed bioweapons so adaptive, so insidious, that even the most advanced medical technologies failed to contain them. And worst of all, they fought dirty. For every human warship that fell, 3 more rose in its place. For every city that was bombed into dust, humanity retaliated with the precision of an executioner. The war was supposed to last weeks. Instead, it became something else. It became the greatest war the galaxy had ever seen. And as the council forces began to fall back, retreating from what should have been an easy extermination, a dreadful realization settled over them. They had awoken something they could not control. They had forced humanity to evolve again. And this time, the galaxy would not survive the consequences. Chapter 4. The End of the Old Galaxy. The war had begun, but it did not unfold as the Galactic Council had expected. They had believed that their overwhelming numbers, superior technology, and coordinated strategy would lead to a swift and decisive eradication of the human race. They had believed that humanity, for all its defiance, was doomed from the moment the vote had passed. They were wrong. Instead of cowering in fear, humanity adapted with terrifying speed. Instead of retreating, they advanced. Instead of perishing under the might of the Council's vast armadas, they turned every battle into a war of attrition, dragging their enemies into a battlefield that had no rules, no mercy, and no escape. The Council's first mistake had been assuming that humanity's survival depended on Earth. By the time the first Council fleets arrived in the Sol system, Earth was already abandoned. The humans had evacuated billions of their kind to hidden colonies, deep space outposts, and rogue planets far beyond the Council's reach. The cities they left behind were not empty, nor were they defenseless. They were bait. The moment the first orbital bombardment struck the surface, the humans triggered their final contingency plan. Earth was sacrificed, but it did not go alone. From deep beneath the planetary crust, hundreds of automated nuclear warheads detonated in perfect synchronization. Within moments, the once blue planet was transformed into a furnace of radioactive death. The resulting explosion ripped through the enemy fleets above, vaporizing thousands of warships in an instant, rendering the Sol system a graveyard of shattered hulls and drifting wreckage. The Council had come to exterminate Earth. Instead, they had walked into a trap that cost them nearly a third of their armada. The humans had not lost their homeworld. They had weaponized it. The spread of the human plague. With Earth gone, the Council's forces had no central target. But humanity did. They struck everywhere, all at once. From the deep core worlds of the Vilari Ascendancy to the fortress moons of the Thalzar Dominion, human warbands infiltrated, attacked, and destroyed key infrastructure with terrifying precision. They hijacked supply routes, dismantled energy grids, and disrupted council communications. The worst part? They didn't always come in warships. By the time the council realized what was happening, human hybrids had already infiltrated their societies, working from within. They were officers in alien militaries. They were scientists in research facilities. They were engineers aboard council dreadnoughts. And when the time came, they turned against their hosts. Entire fleets went dark as human-aligned officers sabotaged hyperdrives, disabled shields, and left their ships defenseless. Council leaders vanished overnight, found dead in their private chambers, their security forces compromised by assassins carrying human DNA. The war was no longer a war. It was a total collapse. Humanity was not winning through strength alone. They were winning through biological warfare, through deception, through the simple, terrifying fact that they could integrate into any society and thrive. The one thing the Council had feared most, the spread of the human genome, had now become their downfall. The same hybrids they had sought to exterminate were now leading the charge against them. And the worst was yet to come. The first species to fall. The VLR ascendancy was the first to break. Once the most technologically advanced empire in the galaxy, their fall was sudden and absolute. Their reliance on mathematical precision and calculated strategy had left them vulnerable to unpredictability. Humans thrived on chaos, on adaptability, on exploiting weaknesses that no simulation could predict. When the first human VLR hybrids rose to power, the Ascendancy's genetic councils tried to suppress them. They failed. Within a decade, pureblood VLR were a minority in their own empire. The new generation of hybrids were smarter, stronger, and utterly loyal to the human cause. The Scari Dominion was next. The reptilian warlords had prided themselves on their genetic purity, believing their evolutionary path had made them superior. But they had not accounted for the human genetic anomaly. Human Scari hybrids were born larger, faster, more resilient than their Scari ancestors. And when the Council called upon the Dominion's armies to fight against humanity, those hybrids refused. They did not just refuse. They revolted. The great Scari war machine collapsed overnight, its own soldiers turning against it. By the time the Council realized what had happened, the once mighty Dominion had been absorbed into the expanding human empire. One by one, the other species fell. Not because of war, but because their own people had been replaced. The last stand of the Council. Only a handful of civilizations remained when the final battle began. The remnants of the Galactic Council, what was left of them, gathered in the ancient halls of their dying empire, preparing for one last stand. It was hopeless. They had spent decades trying to eradicate humanity. Instead, humanity had become them. Their armies were no longer their own. Their leaders were no longer pure-blooded. Their children, their future, carried human blood. And when the final battle came, there was no battle at all. The Council did not fall to an armada. It did not fall to nuclear fire. It fell to a simple truth. There were no longer enough non-humans left to fight. The war had been lost before it had even begun. And in the ruins of the old Galactic Council, a new empire rose. A single, unified civilization. A species that was no longer just human. It was something new. Something more. Something that had no rivals left to challenge it. Humanity had not just won. They had become the galaxy itself. And there was no one left to stop them. Epilogue. The future of the human empire. 1,000 years passed. The old alien civilizations were no more. The term pureblood had long since faded from memory. The galaxy was now ruled by a species that had once been called human, but was now something far greater. They were not conquerors. They were not tyrants. They were simply everywhere. Every species, every bloodline, every genetic path had led to them. They had spread not through war, but through time, through generations of integration, through a simple, undeniable truth. They had bred the galaxy into their own image. The humans had won, and no one even remembered a time when it had been any different.